Hello, this is The Voice of Russia, and I'm Tim Ecott. The British government's Department of Energy and Climate Change publishes the following facts. The Earth's surface has warmed by about 0.8 degrees centigrade since 1900 and by around half a degree centigrade since the 1970s. More than 30 billion tonnes of CO2 are emitted globally each year by burning fossil fuels. Average global temperatures may rise between 1.1 and 6.4 degrees centigrade above the levels they were at in 1990 by the end of this century. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concludes that these temperature rises are most likely connected with anthropocentric or human-caused greenhouse gases. And yet, in spite of a spate of severe weather events linked to climate change in recent years, many people remain sceptical that the changes are happening, or if they are, that they're anything more than cyclical events, relatively normal in the Earth's history. To discuss whether the UK and indeed the globe is on the right path to facing what Professor Stephen Hawking described this year as the greatest threat to humanity, I'm joined by Joan Whally, the Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent North and Chair of the House of Commons Environmental Audit Select Committee. I'm also here with Lord Christopher Monckton, once a member of the Conservative Party, more recently a candidate for the UK Independence Party, for whom he was a spokesman on climate change. And he's an expert reviewer for the IPCC 2013 Fifth Assessment Report. My third guest is Bob Ward, Policy and Communications Director for the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change at the London School of Economics. Let me ask you all briefly. Joan Whally, you receive submissions from scientists on this topic all the time and listen to lots of evidence. How worried are you about the threat, long-term or short-term, to the UK or indeed of the wider planet from climate change?
Well, it's quite clear that the threat to the planet is out there. We have the scientific evidence. And for my part, we hold this planet in trust for future generations. And to be ostrich-like and not to take note of what is happening, to my mind, is treacherous. And it is absolutely important that we work together across different nations in heed of the scientific evidence to make sure that future generations have got the legacy that we need to give to them.
So how worried are you?
Very worried. But I think we've got the opportunity to take action. And as long as we can link up the innovation and the technology with the scientific evidence, then I think that there are ways of actually dealing with this challenge which we all face.
Lord Christopher Monckton, how worried are you?
Not really worried at all. There are two questions that, if one were being rigorous scientifically about this, one would ask. The first question is, how much warming are we likely to get caused by us over the next 100 years? And even that's quite a stretch, making reliable predictions. And the next question is, even if the rate of warming that has not occurred so far but is predicted by the IPCC on its current disposition proves to be correct, is it cost effective to act to prevent that warming happening, or is it more cost effective to let it happen and pay the cost of adapting in a focused way to its consequences? The answer to the first question is that the climate models on which the IPCC relies have multiplied by 3 what is generally accepted as the direct warming that you'd get from CO2 by praying in aid so-called climate feedbacks or temperature feedbacks, which, however, not one of which can be measured. And there's a growing evidence in the peer-reviewed literature now that these feedbacks, rather than being net positive very strongly, are in fact net negative. In other words, the effect of the feedbacks is to slightly reduce the 1 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2, and therefore about 1 Celsius of warming over the current century that we might get. And it's about 10 times more expensive to try to make global warming go away today by the measures such as those the Climate Change Department is indulging in, rather than to sit back and do nothing and leave it to future generations. It may sound cruel, but actually it makes economic sense.
Not cruel enough to worry you too much. Bob Ward from the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change at LSE. How worried are you by what we know or don't know so far?
Well, contrary to the account just given by Christopher Monckton, there are huge risks associated with unmitigated climate change. And this is why. If you look back through the Earth's history and all the other ways we can of measuring how the Earth's temperature responds to changes in greenhouse gas concentrations, you get an average for a doubling of greenhouse gas concentrations of between 2 and 4.5 degrees rise in global temperature. 2 and 4.5 degrees rise in global temperature probably doesn't sound much compared to daily fluctuations, but that's a global average. And the way to calibrate it is 5 degrees is about the difference between today's average temperature and the temperature at the last ice age. And we're heading at the moment towards a rise in temperature of 3 degrees and more. And we haven't seen that on Earth for at least 3 million years, the Pliocene era, when the ice packs were very much smaller and global sea level was 15 to 25 meters higher than it is today. So anybody who says that we can comfortably adapt to that kind of world is really living in a fantasy world.
I will come to the detail of who's right, who's wrong, and what the science tells us. I know some of it is conflicting, but just to go back to you, Joan Whally, as a member of the House of Commons Environmental Audit Select Committee, you're getting submissions from people on this, you're hearing experts. But what is the British government doing or not doing that it should be doing, you believe, in the face of some of this scientific evidence?
Well, I think the first point that I wish to make is that the Select Committee, which I chair in the previous Parliament, devoted virtually all of its inquiries just to looking at the whole theme of climate change. And we felt it was important to support the legislation which has now gone through Parliament, which is the Climate Change Act, which actually sets targets as to how we're going to be on course, hopefully, to make sure that we don't go beyond that 2 degrees centigrade by the year 2050. And to put that in place, we have to start now. And so, therefore, I think that the important thing now is that we have to be looking at how that Climate Change Act gets implemented. It has a report to Parliament every year. And contrary to the emotive language that we've just heard from Lord Monckton talking about, indulge in all of this, I think that it's a question of trust. It's a trust between representatives and certainly in our country, the British public, because I believe that people who vote for MPs or who are on the receiving end of what government does, they need to have trust that the important issues which we need to be addressing now in the short term and in the medium and long term, that our governments are on course to do the right thing. And therefore I think it's absolutely critical that we make sure that in everything that we do, particularly at this time of economic recession, that we look at the opportunities. And I would disagree with what's just been said by Lord Monckton, because actually to spend the money now up front and to start to put us on that course is going to be, if you like, it's going to give us a double win situation, because it's going to help with the climate change issue, but it's also going to be able to address the issues of growth in the economy as well.
Let's come back to you, Lord Monckton. A stitch in time saves 9. I mean, the scientific evidence it's a massive body of evidence, isn't it, that these changes are happening? And you're quibbling more about how we deal with the threat.
That some changes are happening is undeniable. That some part of those changes are contributed to by us is also undeniable. It's very long established science. However, even if the amount of warming that was predicted by the IPCC, which is currently just short of 3 Celsius over the current century, even if that were to occur, and let's remember that in the last 16 years it's been statistically no different from zero. We've had no global warming now for 16 years on all of the measures. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard Bob Ward stating what I believe to be false, and you can check this by going even to the Met Office website, or you can go to any of the 5 global temperature data sets
and get
may I please finish? May I please finish?
By the Met Office, which shows that you're
may I please finish? Yeah. Even if there were as much warming as the IPCC predicts going to happen, so far it's 0 over this century, but let's pretend, then even then, it is an order of magnitude, i.e. at least 10 times, more expensive to act now than to leave it and act later. And that is a matter not of opinion, but of rigorous scientific inquiry. I went to see the Climate Change Department about this, and I said, can you show me your calculations showing how much global warming will be made to go away by the £723 billion the Act commits you to spend over the next 40 years? The reply from their chief scientist, Professor David Maguire, in front of the Minister and the Permanent Secretary was, we have done no such calculation. There is no economic case for acting now, and that is, those who do science by consensus, which to some extent I think both of my colleagues in this studio do, will have to accept that in the economic peer-reviewed literature, other than the government reports like Stern, who assumed a 10% chance the entire planet would be destroyed by global warming this century, and therefore produced silly figures, all peer-reviewed economic reports, including my own, say that there is no case, economically speaking, for taking any action now at all, because the amount of damage we're likely to get, even if it's as large as predicted, is it's actually cheaper not to try to stop that and simply to adapt to it when it happens. That's the economic reality.
Is that the parliamentary view, Joan Whally?
Well, I want to hear from Bob, because I believe that the information that he's got is absolutely critical to this. But just before we do, I don't see any reference in what's just been said about the precautionary principle. And I don't think that we can even begin to debate this if we have regard to the planet on the precautionary principle. And what we've just heard completely discounts that totally. But I think it's important that we give Bob his say.
Bob, you were going to take issue with some of the statistics or facts that Christopher's just given us.
Well, almost everything he said is demonstrably false. So let's start with his initial claim about the last 15 years of global temperature measurements. So you can go, and the fact checkers will have an absolute field day, as they usually do with a lot of the things that Christopher Monckton says. So the last 15 years, if you look at the monthly global average temperature measurements, they were published on updated on the Met Office's website a couple of weeks ago. You have a look at the last 15 years, and you'll see that the Earth has been warming at a linear rate of about 0.05 degrees per decade. Okay? So his statement that it's statistically insignificant is absolutely false. No, you've had your chance to speak. Now let's hear the facts. Now that you've spoken, let's hear some of the facts. And here's the paper that proves it. Here's the scientific paper by the Met Office staff who will monitor this, and this is what they say, and that's exactly what it says. No, absolutely not true.
0.05
absolutely not true.
Per decade.
Well, are you going to allow him to interrupt me, or are you going to let me do it?
I have to let Bob speak on the mic, because otherwise the listener just won't get your point or his point. So I will give you all as even a share of the programme as I can.
What it's like to be interrupted. He will, I hope, not interrupt me in future. I shall be quiet.
I will try to let you all speak your piece. I'm sorry, Bob, if you would resume. You claim you have the scientific evidence, which is peer-reviewed, which disproves some of the statistics Christopher was giving us.
Here's the paper by the Met Office staff who monitor the global average temperature, and it proves that Christopher Monckton is just simply making false statements about the fact that temperature is at a standstill now. So it shows that if you measure it over a period of 30 years or more, not 15 years, which is a statistical trick used by skeptics to try and convince people
you would accept that 15
stop.
years isn't really significant in statistical terms, or
well,
not?
It gives you it doesn't tell you about the underlying trend. If you look at the last 15 years of monthly global temperature measurements, you get a linear trend of warming of 0.05 degrees per decade, right? He can't deny that. Well, he can deny it, but it'll be simply flying in the face of the facts and what the peer-reviewed science says. But if you look over a longer period, and this is what meteorologists recommend, is you look over a longer period for underlying trends, the Earth is warming at a rate of about 0.16 or 0.17 degrees per decade, okay? You extrapolate that simply over the next 100 years, you're talking about 1.6 to 1.7 degrees centigrade, which is already outside the range that Christopher Monckton's talking about.
These sound like small figures to the layperson, but give us an example of what impact that relatively small sounding effect on temperature change would have for human populations.
Well, even if we were to continue at the current rate, we're talking about 1.6 to 1.7 degrees. The last time the Earth was 2 to 3 degrees warmer than it is today was about 3 million years ago, when we were talking about the ice sheets in Antarctica and Arctic being much smaller and global sea levels were 15 to 25 meters higher. Now, it's very difficult to imagine that world, let alone make some fantasy estimate of how much cheaper it would be to cope with that world than it is to act now. And the economics is very clear about this as well. And let's deal with Christopher Monckton's arguments, because his argument is essentially anti-markets. From an economics point of view, climate change is the result of a market failure. And that's because the price you pay for goods and services that produce greenhouse gases does not reflect the true costs as are imposed on other people through the impacts of climate change. And so what you do to address a market failure like that is not to pretend that the market failure hasn't happened, but instead to use appropriate public policy to put the costs back on. And that's the basis for providing a carbon price. You use a carbon tax or you use a cap and trade system. It puts the price back on. It's absolutely in line with the principle of the polluter pays.
Christopher, let me ask you to respond to that as briefly as you can. Why is it in anyone's interest to go against the scientific evidence?
Right, first of all, I'm not going against the scientific evidence. There are two schools of thought in the literature, and in the economic literature, it is near unanimous that it is not cost-effective to try to stop this compared with letting it happen. Now, hang on. No, it's my turn now. Please do not interrupt.
Well, Christopher, I'll monitor it.
May I therefore reply very briefly to the points before I'm interrupted? Now, he said, for instance, that the last time the temperature was 2 to 3 Celsius warmer than today was 2 or 3 million years ago. No, it wasn't. It was 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. In some parts of the world, it was as recently as the medieval warm period. It was 2 Celsius warmer in the Roman warm period. It was 2 Celsius warmer in the Minoan warm period. And the biggest, the Holocene climate optimum because it was warmer, as the meteorologists call it, was 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. And apart from one little dip in the middle, for most of the time it was 3 Celsius warmer than today. So, likewise, is it statistically significant? You have to take a 60-year period so as to avoid the 30-year warming and 30-year cooling phases of the great ocean oscillations. Over the 60 years since around 1952, the world has warmed at a rate of 1.2, equivalent to 1.2 Celsius per century. That is warming, but that warming has actually been going on for 300 years, since 1695.
But we haven't had the physical evidence of things like the Arctic ice sheet melting at an unprecedented rate in the last 2 centuries. We've been going there for more than 200 years.
We only have 30 years records. And if you look at such records as were available before we had the complete coverage that only satellites can give us, there was a report in 1922 by the US Meteorological Service saying they had never seen so little ice as in the Arctic as there was then. It is arguable that the ice then and all the way through the 30s was less in the Arctic than it is now, but we don't simply have enough records because we didn't have satellites until then.
Is that your view, Joan Whally? I mean, you've been listening to people talking about this in the Select Committee for some time.
Well, there's obviously concern which we highlight in our report, Protecting the Arctic, which we published earlier this month. Which is looking at the ice sheet and the warning bells that are going off there. But I just want to take issue with what Christopher Monckton just said about the economic case. It completely disregarded the failure to take on board the actual environmental aspects of all of this. And you cannot keep on looking at an economic case to do something without taking on board the external or the externalities of environmental costs. And we do that at our peril. And therefore, to have to listen to all of this about, how the environmental limits are not being taken into account, I don't think helps this argument at all. I want us to get on to what we can practically do, because I think that people out there, right the way across the planet, people who are facing the effects of global warming and will be in some of the island countries and so on, we need to be looking at this from a point of view of foreign and Commonwealth policy, and we need to be looking at what progress we can make with the next round of the United Nations talks, which are taking place in Doha next month. And these are really important issues that I think people are concerned about.
I'd like to broaden the conversation out, in fact, towards that, because I know we can argue about the science, and I can't intervene and say who's right, who's wrong. I know you each have your views.
But that's why I said the precautionary principle is so important.
Indeed. But I wanted to ask you, Joan, I'll start with you. It seems to me that the environment as a whole, in what we like to call austerity Britain these days, has gone off the public agenda and indeed the political agenda. Indeed, our current government came in making green promises, which they seem to have let go onto the back burner. But a recent study showed that British people are even more sceptical about climate change than anyone else in the world, even more than Americans. How do you account for that?
Well, I think the most important thing is that we need informed public debate. And I think we need to get away from this feeling that so many people have, well, if there was really a problem, somebody would do something about it, and actually understand that the mechanics of doing something about it is very complex, and it's not instant, it's not overnight, and it is long term. And therefore, I think it's important that people are able to trust their public representatives to be brokering the kind of solutions with business, with other countries, to have that kind of level playing field to act. There's no doubt about it. You know, we had a government that came in, the greenest government ever. And when you start to look at the record of this government and you start to look at some of the statements that we've been hearing from the Treasury, one wonders whether or not that mission or that vision that was there is still there. And it's very important that we hold government to account for that. And I believe that the important way of taking this forward is through the delivering the targets which were set out in the Climate Change Act. And we've just seen only in the last few weeks that John Gunner, Lord Deben, who's now the chairman of the Climate Change Committee, it's absolutely essential that the warnings that he's given to governments in the UK are heeded, and that we just, if you like, become single-minded in how we look at the issue that we have about our dependence upon carbon and the opportunities that moving towards new innovative technologies gives us, not only in dealing with the lack of growth at the moment, but putting us on the right track for the long term.
But is the government, or government in general, and politicians like yourself, are you still slightly putting your heads in the sand? Because there is this sense that until we're all freezing or roasting,
by which time it's too late.
Nobody's really going to react to this.
Well, I think this is the problem that we have with the democracy and political debate that we have at the moment, because inevitably people just look at the immediate problems. You know, it's like being at an airport and you've got the radar and you've got everything coming in at you. But I think that we are entitled to ask of our public representatives that they address the long-term issues. And I think that the point that was made earlier on about how we actually incorporate the environmental externalities in current economic thinking and how we go beyond GDP is absolutely critical, and the way in which we need to have regard to the whole issues of sustainable development. And until we have that wider understanding, we are going to be at risk of this above 2 degrees centigrade rise. And then what can we do for future generations? We've blown it.
Bob Ward, seems like ancient history now, but Kyoto, Copenhagen, there is the perception, even amongst passionate environmentalists in this country, that when you get to the governmental and certainly the intergovernmental level, it's almost impossible to reach consensus on what needs to be done, or enforcing people to do what scientists believe needs to be done to mitigate the negative consequences of climate change. Is that something that scientists can push forward in any way?
The evidence is that all the governments of the world really understand the science. They have chief scientific advisors, they have scientific academies that provide them with the advice. And your listeners can go online and check the fact that none of the scientific organisations around the world agree with their rather bizarre account of the science that Christopher Monckton gave earlier. So they can go and see, and that's what governments listen to. And they have already agreed that what we should be trying to do is reduce global emissions in line to give ourselves at least a reasonable chance of avoiding a warming of more than 2 degrees. Now that means reducing global emissions by about 50% by 2050. And that's a huge task, but it's one that it's both technically feasible and economically affordable. If you invest in a new form of an electricity system that is more efficient, that relies less on restricted resources, fossil fuels, most people in Britain understand that their fuel bills have been going up steadily over the last 8 years. That's because Britain's becoming more dependent on imports of gas from outside. So it makes no sense for us to become even more dependent on fossil fuels than we are now. It's better to develop our domestic supplies of clean energy, and that's where a lot of the investment should be going. And Russia, as a major player in the world amongst oil producers, ought to be leading the way in developing that, because it has a lot of reserves at the moment of fossil fuels. They're very valuable, but they're not valuable if they can't be used. And that's why Russia ought to be really pushing forward as a leader in the development of carbon capture and storage technology.
Joan, let's bring you in on this.
Well, I got this really important round, COP18 coming up in Doha, and I think that the way in which Christine Figueres, who's been leading on some of the ways of actually getting the developing countries, the developed countries together, and I think Russia's got a really important part to play in this on the whole issue of mitigation and the way in which we can fund the climate finance that is needed. And we do have an opportunity at that conference with all our national representatives to actually take account of the science and to devise policies which are going to be not only fit for purpose for that, if we can just make progress. And I am very clear from the contacts that I have and an organisation that I belong to, Globe, which is an organisation of parliamentarians from different countries, that this is an issue which is just as important to MPs, irrespective of whether or not they are government ministers. And I truly believe that select committees, including our own and the House of Commons, has an important role to play in actually getting this agenda properly with the informed public debate in order that we can start to look at the ways in which we can reduce carbon and move towards much more sustainable sources of energy and energy security as well. And that's what we can talk about Lord Monckton's friends, but actually that's what people, particularly women, want as well for the future.
Bob Ward, it must come back to you. We've heard conflicting evidence, conflicting opinions. Do you think Britain carbon-based fuels, but is Britain taking enough of a lead on this in terms of the global strategy?
Well, Britain has been in a leadership position. As Joan mentioned, many other countries admire the fact that we've introduced legislation which has made clear that we're going to reduce our emissions by about 80% by 2050.
Is that really going to happen?
Yes, it really can happen, and it's only political will that will stop it from happening, because it's, as I said, technologically feasible and economically affordable. And indeed, what's happening at the moment, though, is that a number of developing countries, which are seeking, understandably, to overcome poverty and recognize that most of the rising greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have been caused by the developed countries, they expect the developed countries to lead by example. And that's why the UK, even though it's only responsible for a small proportion of all the global emissions, has a disproportionately big impact on global politics around climate change, because it's about a rich country. You know, UK was the heart of the Industrial Revolution in the 17th and 18th century, and we need to demonstrate that we can develop a low-carbon economy. And it's already happening. We can see that it's possible, and it's entirely more desirable than what we might face if we don't. And people can see what will happen if we don't, because they can see, for instance, the fact that we've had in Russia, in the last 3 years, some very high summer temperatures and drought conditions. Indeed, it's only in the last couple of months that Russia has been making a decision about whether the wheat crops, which are 25% down on average, whether they're able to export anything. We remember back in 2010, because of drought, Russia was no longer able to export any crops because all that it was producing had to be used for domestic consumption. Now, that's the kind of world we will have if we allow climate change to carry on. That's the difference between acting and not acting.
Well, I hope we haven't unduly alarmed our listeners. We'll have to leave the discussion there. Lord Christopher Monckton, thank you for joining us today on The Voice of Russia. Joan Whally, Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent North, and Bob Ward from the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change at the London School of Economics. Thank you all.